The modern left critique of capitalism essentially is a root critique of fractional reserve central banking. A phrase you hear is we're at the end of capitalism. I think actually capitalism is the best of what we can conjure up as humans for an economic system. Communism and socialism don't work. They end in death and despair and poverty and ruin. No one hops on a skiff from America to go down to Venezuela right now. They're not risking their family's life and their own lives. Big government is bad. They will continue to grow and to overreach. And the pessimist in me fears we're beyond a point of no return with how big the government is now. Small government is good for everybody. I also believe in the will of the people. And at some level, I also believe the state can be a helpful ally in that. But I don't think the state is the answer to the solution. What is the American man's frontier?
Nick, thanks for coming on the show, man.
Yeah, glad to be here, Nolan. It's an honor, man.
This is exciting. This is, you'll find very soon, if you don't already know, it's pretty conversational. Not a lot of structure. I have no notes written down. I want to start by saying thank you for the man that you are and your friendship. You are a unique individual, and I truly feel it's an honor to be acquainted with you. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm excited for what you've already done with the Tyro experience and for what you will do with it. You've got 85 episodes in, and I looked back in episode 2 with your grandfather, telling some powerful stories of when he was serving in the military. You're going to be able to tell your grandchildren that, and they'll be able to know their great-grandfather after he's gone to really glean what their lineage is and why lineage matters. And that was a place I wanted to actually start about what's in a name. And I think sometimes that can be lost in the West. We're still relatively new. This whole American experience is still new. 250, 240 some years old. That's why when folks from America go and visit Europe, they constantly wonder and marvel at architecture, the history of the culture. That's what happens over thousands of years of growth. So, the West is still a relatively new experience in terms of the American West. And I think what our lineage is matters, knowing where we came from, knowing what's in a name. There was that 2019 documentary about Muhammad Ali called What's in a Name. And it came from a famous story when he was fighting the boxer, I think his name was Elijah Terrell. And this is right when Ali had undergone his name change from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali because of his Muslim faith. And Terrell refused to call him that name in the pressers beforehand. And I think the fight went 15 rounds. And every time Ali would lean into him and hit him with a good punch or a jab, he would say, "What's my name?" And it mattered so deeply to Ali, and that was a part of his fighter's psyche in that. And to tie it back into why I think it matters for you is, your sons and your grandsons will know who Nolan Wilson is and was, who your grandfather is and was. And that's why I think the beauty of a podcast is to be able to hand down these lessons. In the West, there are generational cultural changes. Men in prior generations to us maybe didn't have opportunities to tell their story other than sitting around by a fire and oral tradition, or maybe undiscovered journals, after they were long gone. And I think the opportunity to have these episodes to pass down to your grandsons is a huge deal. And that's also how the Gospels start. In the Bible, the first book in the New Testament, the book of Matthew starts by giving the genealogy of Jesus. And regardless of where you come from a faith perspective, I think the Bible is a helpful and useful book to read at minimum. I always used to gloss over the genealogies. I thought, this is just useless information. Let's get to the meat of the story. It's actually very important to start there, because when Matthew's telling the genealogy of Jesus at the time of Jesus' preaching, Jesus is starting to become popular, it mattered to the Jews and the Pharisees of that time to know what Jesus' genealogy was. Matthew starts out saying, Jesus came from the founding fathers of Israel, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And the Pharisees, the Jews, they hear that at first and they think, oh, great, this guy's one of us. We're going to like this guy. And then as Matthew gets through the genealogy, he gets to the middle point, and there's some outsiders. There's some suspect characters, and they start to say, I don't know if I like this guy. And so that's the beauty of how Matthew starts off the book with the genealogy of Jesus, because he comes from the founding fathers of the Israeli lineage, of the faith of followers of God, the Israelites. And he gets through the genealogy, and there's some not so good or sexy characters in there. And so that's a huge theme in the Gospels, is that the outsiders become the insiders, and names lineage genealogies matter.
Yeah, that's extremely well said. We spoke about this last week when we had breakfast, but the podcast is something I never really thought about from that perspective as like almost conversations for my son or my grandsons. It's kind of cool to think about. You're exactly right. I had my papa on my second episode, which is kind of hilarious. There's like some hilarity in that, but he's also a very cool guy.
Yeah.
If my grandsons listen to my second episode of my podcast, that means they'll get to hear their grandfather speak with their great-grandfather. That's pretty cool. I've never really thought about that, and the lessons that can be passed down from not just that conversation, but conversations like this or conversations with other people I've had on and will continue to have on. That's a super cool, and it's almost like a new North Star for me, because I'm like, okay, well, what would I want my grandson or my son to get out of this conversation? It's obviously for me as well, because I have a lot of progress to make as well, a lot of things to be better at. But that is a really cool idea to me, to be able to pass these conversations, almost like a book, like an audio book of conversations from me, their father, to them. And then your comment about the name, your many comments, I think that's such an interesting point. I was 25 years old when we talked about this as well, but I was 25 years old when I actually looked up what my name meant, which I think is interesting. I wish, you can't go back, but I wish that I learned what it meant earlier. And I would honestly encourage anybody that's listening to go look it up, because I think it's a fascinating thing. I went and looked up like everybody in my family. There's a lot of power in a name, and it's interesting you draw the correlation between the beginning of the Gospels, because I, like you, there's like whole chapters where it's like, right. This is so boring to me, but it's in there for a reason, and it's the start for a reason, right?
And your name meant noble, resolute protector.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, noble. Yeah, essentially noble, resolute protector.
That's strong.
Yeah, I don't know. Oh, Philip, my middle name means lover of horses. So.
Okay.
So noble, lover of horses, resolute protector.
I think the cowboy fits, man. I think you're meant to wear it, the cowboy hat.
Look, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's probably a duck. But I want to get into a little bit more of that, especially like the gospel and the genealogy part. One thing I do want to get, we both have, we did not communicate about this, but we both bought Olympus Gum cans. I want to talk about this for a little bit, because I do think it's important, and it's something, as you know, I've been chewing either Phileme or Mesa gum for like the better part of 6 years, since I read Breath by James Nestor. And I genuinely think it's an extremely important part of, I don't even know how, I think it's an important part of a lot of things, but like to name a few: athletic performance, your sleep quality, your actual looks, like how you present yourself to the world. Why did you feel compelled to start Olympus Gum?
Well, Austin, Texas is an esoteric health node in the world for folks exploring what health means to them. Maybe in some ways going back to tradition, and in some ways exploring new frontiers. And so, when I became curious about what health meant for me and started my own health journey, just like you did, just like many others that have come on your podcast have talked about, I stumbled upon this product as one of these new products I had never heard about. And I tried a few different brands, and they made me aware of the product, but it never really satiated me. I wondered if there was something better out there. So natural curiosity and just an adventurous spirit drove me to research this island in Greece. There's a small island called Chios in the eastern Aegean Sea, basically near Turkey. You can see Turkey from there. And one day I decided to just take a trip out there. I had the time and the energy and the youth to do it. So I went out there and started touring these mastic tree groves. So essentially what mastic gum is, it's dried tree resin that can really only grow on this island of Chios, Greece. And there's kind of a mystery behind it. And there's intrigue because it can't really grow elsewhere. You can harvest tree resin, obviously, in other areas of the world, but only on this island will the resin harden and fall to the ground and kind of be a ready-to-chew gum. And, there's some science behind it. There's a debate about whether this is true or not. But essentially, there are dormant underwater volcanoes underneath this island. And very smart people who have studied this think that the mineral concentration in the earth obviously contributes to the soil, which then contributes to the growth of the tree, which contributes to the resin that the tree releases, and that allows the sap to crystallize and dry. So how the farmers harvest this mastia, it's a very labor-intensive process, but they make incisions on the tree with a short knife, and the tree heals itself with this resin. And so it's a very beautiful process. It's got deep meaning. And the product is, one ingredient, a true whole food. I call it nature's chewing gum. Folks debate whether or not it actually changes your face and your jawline, and I like to believe so. And anecdotally, I've seen some difference in how I look over chewing for a year and a half. But scientifically, the benefits that are proven are that it increases the gut microbiome diversity. So it increases how flexible and adaptable your gut is. And so a strong treatment that mastic helps with is combating the growth of H. pylori, which is a stomach bacteria. And so I found that in the cafes, in the restaurants, after a long dinner, a rich dinner, the Greeks would start chewing this, and I'd ask them why. And they would use it kind of as a digestif, a way to, put a period on the end of a long, nice, rich meal and make sure that the rich lamb and the wine they were drinking digested well, and they were able to, go to sleep and not have stomach issues. And so they would chew this to satiate their appetite at the end of a long meal and to aid in digestion. So the benefits for your gut are strong with mastic gum. And, I just think it's a cool product. The island of Chios has been traded numerous times, by different people groups and nations that have warred over it for what they called white gold, which is this mastia. You can use it to ground into a liquor, which you can drink. Obviously, I went to a bar one time in Los Angeles, and they had sweet mastia liquor. It's very delicious. The Greeks will also use it to bake cakes, so in confectionery, and then they also use it in skincare. And so it's a very diverse item that you can use in many different applications. And I just think it's a wonderful product, and it's just an easy choice to assimilate into your day, whether you want facial and aesthetic gains, whether you want to calm a disrupted gut, or whether, you're somebody who has an oral fixation and you like candy, or you chew traditional artificial sweetener gum a lot. You can work it into your lifestyle that way as well. Yeah,
I agree with everything you said, and I also think it's very interesting because I didn't know a lot about I didn't know they called it white gold. That makes sense. I didn't know that, people have used mastia powder for like a long, long, long time for the reasons you're mentioning. It's funny how the vast majority of the West, I guess, will use this for the facial and the becoming more handsome.
Right.
But I found it very interesting because I remember in James Nestor's book, or maybe subsequently after I read that book, I looked into it. Maybe he mentioned it in the book, but like the gut microbiome, also good for your mouth. Like it's an antimicrobial, antibacterial, something like that. The fascinating thing to me about that book, and the reason I started doing it, one, I was an athlete, so I wanted to sleep better. I wanted to be able to breathe better during workouts and stuff like that. And he talked about nasal breathing being basically like the number one thing you can do. Number two, mewing, which, are you familiar with mewing?
Right.
At the top of your tongue, or like whatever, however that works. But then he mentioned these gums, and it's the story that he relayed, which really hooked me. He got either some scan or an x-ray of his jaw at, let's say, point A, and then chewed either phlegm or mastic gum for, do you say mastic or mastic?
I've heard both. I say mastic, but I don't think it matters.
What did I just say, mastic?
Mastic.
Okay. I'll say mastic. He chewed either one of those two gums for a year or something, maybe a little bit longer. But he gained the equivalent of, and then got another x-ray, he gained the equivalent of 5 pennies worth of bone, which is it's a non-trivial amount of bone.
Right.
That really hooked me because I'm like, okay, well, one, it's the reality of like having a more protruded jawline is good aesthetically, but number two, it clears your airways, allows you to breathe better. So I was hooked since then. And I've chewed other mastic gums as well. I like yours the best. That's why I wanted to ask you about it.
I appreciate that, and that's a great point about the it cleans the bacteria out of your mouth. I didn't even think to mention that one. The Greeks would kind of use this as their daily breath freshener and oral cleanser. And then I also think something that's interesting about it is that the masseter muscle is often considered pound for pound the strongest muscle in the body. So the masseter muscle is this muscle kind of runs along our jawline right here that aids in giving us bite force. And I'm curious, and I'm on this journey of learning about what humans have consumed and eaten, prior to this industrial revolution that we've had. What did we eat? Did we, we were hunter-gatherers. How long did we forage for mushrooms and berries? Until how long were we able to kill animals consistently and consume meat? Were certain areas and tribes more fishing-based? Were certain areas and tribes with rich access to fruit and vegetables and forests, did they eat more fruits and vegetables? My guess is that it's always been this combination of ease of access and safety for what wouldn't kill you versus the civilizations that were able to innovate and engineer new methods to cultivate agriculture or find the best and nutrient-dense animals and kill them and eat them. When I've decided that I'm going to cook a big steak or have a big grill out for friends, I usually will open up a can of mastic and we chew a little bit before. And maybe it's just placebo, maybe not, but it gets the jaw warmed up, and I find that I can eat more lightly cooked or even raw meat better after getting the jaw warmed up for this. And I'm sure some of it's placebo, but it feels kind of like a primal thing to do that. And in this industrial age, we grew up giving children, Gerber baby food, and we have all this soft, easiest course of use food. And I just don't know if we're meant to be that way.
Yeah, he mentions that at length in the book about the processed food epidemic and how he even mentions if you go back and look at the skeletal structures of faces from different times, you can quite literally see that human beings' faces are becoming more intruded and skinnier, like longer and skinnier, which is fascinating because, like you mentioned, I don't know if you've ever eaten like wild game or like a hind quarter of a deer or something. It's not like you're swallowing that without chewing.
You're wrestling with it.
Yeah.
And that book by Nestor Breath is such a great fundamental work for so many different issues. I had allergy and asthma problems that were intertwined and was a mouth breather for a while. So mewing, chewing mastic, focusing on keeping my mouth shut, maybe using mouth tape at night, using nasal strips to open up my nasal passages, all actually do have real benefits in your daily life. I don't have, the afternoon drag or lull anymore thanks to a combination of diet and sleep and better sleep, which is correlated with all the principles that Nestor and Dr. Mew lay forward in their work. So I think it matters. And, it's just interesting to look at our history as humans. This industrial food process system is all very new. And the negative effects are seen very quickly. And I think that's what's interesting about, something that Robert F. Kennedy has brought into the mainstream of politics and media is the idea of making America healthy again. And I appreciate him for doing that because I think there's some truth to looking at pictures of old beaches and fitness and what our diets consisted of. And I think just the compounding generation over generation of eating these fake and processed foods, it's not good. And we need a return to what is true and noble and honest about eating locally and eating one ingredient foods. And mastic is that for Greece, right? We don't do anything to it in the supply chain. We don't treat it. It's kind of like honey in that it can last a long time. When honey, I don't think honey ever expires to a certain degree.
Don't they call it liquid gold? White gold and liquid gold makes sense.
Perfect connection there.
Many wars were fought over that as well.
Right. So, this is one ingredient. It's natural. It just makes sense to fit into the diet.
Yeah, especially in lieu of, like you said, regular gums. Like you might as well benefit yourself other than just getting like some artificial flavoring and no jaw pump, as you may call it.
Right. And do you ever think about the idea of how in the West we think about food as taste first? And I used to be the same way in my processed food intake. If it didn't taste good, I didn't really want to eat it, or I wasn't going to eat it. But now when you detach from, the quote matrix of the processed food system, you start to crave holy and new and one ingredient beautiful foods. When you go to Italy and you have a fresh catch with fresh pasta, or you have, a beautiful steak from Texas locally that's made with grass-fed butter and sea salt that doesn't have plastic in it, your body will begin to crave these things.
100%. I'm pretty far down that rabbit hole. I think what I've been eating lately actually would probably be borderline on the far side. Like, dude, I've been like boiling chicken and stuff, and like literally boiled chicken with salt. It's not good. But I agree with you. There is. I mean, it kind of stems to what you said. You just mentioned RFK. I kind of want to. I want to say one more thing about the breath, because I think it's so fundamental. This is what really. I listened to Nestor on Rogan, and this is what kind of compelled me to read the book as a college student, as a college athlete. Breathing we can go weeks without food. You can go weeks without water, believe it or not. You could probably go months maybe without food, weeks without water. You can go 4 minutes without breathing, but it's something that the vast majority of human beings think zero about. Even those that meditate and whatever, it's not like a primary thought in their head, which is fascinating to me, because I'm like, okay, if it's the thing that I will do the most, I mean, I do it involuntarily all day long. It's the thing I need the most, or else I'll literally die in a matter of minutes. I want to optimize it. That's one of those things where I'm like, okay, I want to pull the levers that allow me to optimize that. MASIC is absolutely one of those things for me. Yeah, I just felt that was important to mention, because you and I will do a lot of things, but breathing is probably one of the most important.
Very true. And I think there's an interesting connection with breath. Andrew Huberman has done a lot of work on this as well, but about being relaxed. And Huberman had this bit of research he did about how when humans can be in a line of sight where their peripheral is extended, when you're looking at a beautiful sunset over the ocean or a beautiful mountain range out in Montana, sometimes even the artificial version of this is a skyline. But when our eyes lower and become horizontally extended, we relax. And that's different from the vertical raised, I have high stress, I'm in the rat race, I got to rush to get to work, I'm late for my subway. That our breath comes up into our trachea just as our eyes kind of rise, and we all swell up, and that's where we hold tension in our neck and our shoulders. But if you breathe deep down into your lower parts of your lungs, to me, that there's some sort of a connection with seeing a peripheral sunset or a horizon, showing that you're relaxed, you're taking longer, deep breaths. I think there's a lot of power in that. And I think that if you look at higher stress levels in modern day society, if we got to see a sunset more often, or took a 15-second deep breath as a regular cadence more often, I think that would have a very positive effect on day-to-day life.
Yeah, that's the landscape thing is one of those things that I use my intuition a lot more. I follow Laird Hamilton's advice on this. He always says, I follow my intuition, and science usually backs it up. And that's one of those things, anecdotally. I don't need like Huberman or somebody else to tell me, hey, looking at a skyline or a sunset is good for you.
Right.
It's one of those things that just intuitively makes sense to me.
It feels right.
It just feels right, exactly.
Yeah.
Back to the RFK thing. I was actually having a conversation about this with my dad last night. The bringing of health issues to the forefront of the political arena, I believe, is a very, very good thing. I think it's a massive positive. I'm curious what your take on the government being a part of that change. How do you perceive that? Like, what are your thoughts on like the government deciding like whether or not Red 40 is banned or things like that?
That is a great question. I tend to be for freedom, but I also think that the power of long-standing corporations to market and push things on unsuspecting people is criminal. You look at the connection between big food and big pharma. I think that's serious, and I think Kennedy is pushing that narrative in a good way, bringing that into light. But I'm also for freedom. And so that's where I think it's a worthwhile discussion, and I see good points on both sides. There's a gentleman named Delian. He works at Founders Fund. He recently had a pretty inflammatory tweet about how he was against the lab-grown meat ban in Florida. Governor DeSantis in Florida, they're trying to pass a ban on lab-grown meat. I personally don't care for lab-grown meat at all. But Delian had a great point. He said, if we believe we are free and can innovate freely, and if a company can grow lab-grown meat and consumers will buy it, supply demand, they should be able to do that. And so, is Red 40 categorically and scientifically proven to be bad for you? Yes, absolutely. I don't know why in society that we think we need to rework the original design of the world and food to fit maximizing profits and corporate greed, I think it is criminal. But I also agree in the freedom project that is the West and that is America. And so I just think, Nolan, there's a lot of good on both sides. There's my own individual sovereignty and choice as a consumer, which would choose to not consume red meat or lab-grown meat or red 40. But I think people should be free to choose. I know Europe has very strong food regulations, and when people go to Europe, they just feel better. Usually after a vacation, if they're eating bread and pastries and wine even, they come back and they feel better. But Europe has chosen to have stricter regulations. So in my work, I work with a lot of European companies and regulatory agencies, and they buy a very different spec of food than the U.S. does. So there's a point to that.
I'm so glad we brought this up. I was not planning on doing this at all, but it's an important question in my mind because I think, like I mentioned, I agree with everything you just said. I see both sides. I see the fact that these companies have billions and billions and billions of dollars and years and years and years of programming that basically, like you said, they prey on unsuspecting people, which in the name of profit, literally there's nobody that works for any company that sells a product that has Red 40 in it thinks they're doing that for the betterment of the people that are consuming that product. Absolutely. Not a single person. If they do, they're either a liar or they're an idiot. On the other hand, this is what I said last night, and it came to me when I was talking to my dad, because he brought up the same thing. He's like, well, there are like the health numbers in Europe, because we're going back and forth similar to what we're doing now. And what I said to him was, and from my perspective, that's totally fine. Europe can keep their Red 40 free food. I'll keep my AR-15 because I really see there being a distinct correlation, because I don't think there's ever been an instance of a government getting an inch and then giving back that inch. That makes sense. So the way that my mind projects it is, okay, I agree Red 40 is awful. I agree glyphosate is bad. You shouldn't consume food with Red 40. You shouldn't consume lab-grown meat. You shouldn't consume food that's been doused in glyphosate. What's to stop a government in 10 years if they get the power to ban that? If they say, you know what, actually regeneratively raised grass-fed meat is bad for the environment and we won't allow that. If they already have the power to ban foods, which I know they do to some degree now, but like if it expands that power, that scope of power, that's my fear on that side, where I'm like, okay, well, I have zero interest in them being able to ever tell me that I can't eat grass-fed meat. I don't know. I just think it's an important discussion.
I completely agree. And I am in favor of small government as well. And the pessimist in me fears we're beyond a point of no return with how big the government is now. But I also believe in the will of the people and the private sector to change the future of the West and the ability to do and create. You're right. I don't derive my thoughts on society. I try and derive my thoughts on society as little from political discourse as possible, as little from thinking of myself as a left-winger or a right-winger. I want to think of my politics and my life critically and derive them from, in my own perspective, the man of Jesus and how he was and who his life was for and what that represented. But if I think very critically about this, small government is good for everybody. There's a saying that federally, I'm a conservative, meaning I want tight spending. I don't want to be involved in foreign wars. I want the government to, do as little as possible at the federal level. At the state level, I'm a liberal, meaning I want the state to act generously in my local communities and make sure that they solve problems and pay taxes that come back to me at the local level. And then uber locally, hyper locally, I'm a socialist. So that's how the quote goes. I'm not saying that's what I believe, but the quote means hyper locally. I want to give a lot. I want to be kind to my neighbor. I want to share good things. And so I think that's an interesting quote. Do I agree with it 100%? No, but I think it's interesting to zoom out on politics at a federal, a state, and a local level and really think about what that means. So I agree with you. Big government is bad. They will continue to grow and to overreach. I forget, there was a founding father that said giving up privacy for security ultimately results in you getting neither. Mm-hmm. And Ed Snowden, when he exposed the NSA, did a lot of work in kind of the name of that mantra, regardless of what you think of Ed Snowden. But I tend to agree with that. The government will always take a mile if you give them an inch.
Yeah, that's a great quote. about the privacy and security. I think I've heard that before. I can't remember who said it, but it's so true. It really is. I just think about it from like a historical perspective. There's literally never been an instance where, I mean, COVID was a great example of this. Like when you give a government organization or government power, the likelihood of them saying, you know what, we actually don't want this power, we're going to give it back to y'all, it's pretty much zero. So that's my only, I'm glad we brought this up, because it's just an interesting conversation. I think it's worth having too, because I think a lot of people are either like adamantly against it and they can't see the benefit of how much healthier would we be if these foods were banned, how much healthier would and productive as a society and creative as a society would we be if people were metabolically healthy and not subject to these massive companies throwing this poison down their throat at their expense and to the profit of the company. That's one side, but then the other side is like the health person that's kind of just all for like that. They hear health and they're like, okay, cool, I'm for it. I think there's negatives and positives to both, so it's worth discussing about.
There's a great podcast by Balaji Srinivasan. He was former CTO of Coinbase, famous investor, a critical thinker. I appreciate a lot of his work. He's recently coined the term network state, and he talks about how, religion is worldwide, and that kind of was the dominating factor of how civilizations rose and fell. And then the state became something that the non-religious people would worship. And now we're kind of we're growing and evolving into a network state, talking about decentralized networks and private sector companies who hold power and influence, which is the network effect of that. The network effect of companies, the network effect of decentralized currencies like Bitcoin, taking power away from the state and away from the church. Obviously, I come from a faith background, if you can't already tell from the conversation we've had so far. But I also think the church has done harm in the past. And so the Catholic Church is infamous for, taking tithes and proclaiming that you need to tithe to be saved by God, and then doing horrible things with that money. And so I think separating money from church and state as a triune factor is a good thing. But I bring that up, Balaji's work, to say that we are, in modern day West, there are people who either worship a religion or worship the state, or if they don't have the two, now they're trying to find a third to fill the space. And there are many people smarter and more well-read and more well-educated than I that say we really need the state. We need to have the state. And I think there's some truth to that, and I think we can find a middle ground. Do we abandon the state completely? I would say no. But it needs very healthy checks and balances, and the path that it is on, in my opinion, is not a good path.
It's fascinating. I love the connection. As we were talking before we went live, I had Jimmy Song on, who wrote Thank God for Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. I really enjoyed speaking with him. I'm very much so a novice in the world of Bitcoin. You are at a large part of me being orange pilled to any degree that I am. I don't know if I'll ever forget that first conversation at you and Nick or Cole's house. I left. I was like, wow, I just need to sell everything and buy Bitcoin. But nonetheless, I really am fascinated by that title of a book is it's just a phenomenal title. But I'm fascinated by the intersection of God and Bitcoin and sovereignty as a whole. I'm curious to hear your take on that intersection, how those two actually meet in the practical world, in our day-to-day lives.
That's a great question. I think an overarching theme in things we've talked about so far, problems with the health system, problems with big government, the very root of a lot of these problems is the over-financialization of everything. And again, to the theme of not aligning myself with one party or another, I don't think that's helpful. I think we as a people can rise above that, of just thinking critically and seeing what we can agree on and finding common ground. I think a modern left-leaning critique of government in America is that a phrase you hear is we're at the end of capitalism. We're at late-stage capitalism. And I think what they're actually trying to critique is the fractional reserve central banking system we're in. I think actually capitalism is the best of what we can conjure up as humans for an economic system. Communism and socialism don't work. They end in death and despair and poverty and ruin. You've never seen someone fleeing a communist country through a body of water, fleeing a capitalistic country over a body of water to a communist country. It just doesn't happen. No one hops on a skiff from America to go down to Venezuela right now. They're not risking their family's life and their own lives to get to Venezuela. So I think you'd be pretty hard-pressed to find that socialism or communism in any of their forms or interpretations is better than capitalism. But I think the modern left critique of capitalism essentially is a root critique of fractional reserve central banking. And what that is the financialization of our country is built on a central bank. Many people don't know that in the short history of America, we've already had 2 failed central banks, meaning that inflation has gotten bad or a war has happened and our financial services and economy have collapsed and we've had to kind of restart again.
Do you know when those two, sorry to interrupt, but
Sure.
when those 2 banks failed?
2 were in the 19th century. So, 1776 happened and we're kind of this fledgling nation trying to figure out who we are and how we want to build a society. And we had all those founding documents, but I believe they were in the 19th century at different points.
I would assume the Civil War would have something to do with that, right? I mean, maybe I'm mistaken, but intuitively.
And I think
Should I look this up? Just so I brought my laptop.
Look it up. I think one of them actually had to do with maybe the Spanish-American War. And I also know that the modern central bank as we know it was founded in the 19-teens, somewhere around the end of World War III.
The monster, what is it? The Creature of Jekyll
Creature
Island?
from Jekyll Island. That's a great book to look into.
Have you read that?
I've read some of it. It's a thick one. Many folks have had the author on for podcasts. I've more distilled the info via that channel. But essentially, to the point, I think the over-financialization of everything is a problem. When the government controls the money supply, they can create it out of thin air. And that is a problem. That is not a natural action derived from human action. You don't just get something for nothing.
Yeah.
So when the government says, we're going to create $2 trillion, we're going to drop a stimulus check to every American, we're going to send some to Ukraine, we're going to send some to Israel, who pays for that? The answer is the U.S. taxpayer through the theft and debasement of their currency. And so regardless of what you think of Bitcoin, whether it'll be the future reserve currency of the United States or the world, whether it's some CIA-created anonymous fad that'll die in 5 years, regardless of where you land on it, the conversation of Bitcoin should lead us to thinking about bigger questions about money in our society and why things at the gas pump and at the grocery store are 3 and 4 times what they were 4 years ago. That's not natural. The process of creating a steak or harvesting petrol and gas to get to the pump has not gotten 3 or 4 times harder in 3 years. A healthy and efficient economy should actually make that easier and lower cost over time. We're going the other way. Why is that? It's not because the oil companies are becoming less efficient or that the ranchers are becoming less efficient. Is that the people at the top that are pulling the strings are weakening the value of the currency that we trade in. They're devaluing it by printing more. And I think that is unnecessary at best and criminal at worst.
Yeah, I want to go back to this Fed bank thing, but one thing that just brought to my mind is the idea. I don't know what the average raise is per year. 3-4% maybe, something like that. I'm pretty sure it's around the same or around the right number. If inflation is more than this, was like something I thought about. It's like people are actually just losing money every year, but they don't know about this, so they think, oh, I got a 4% raise. It's X amount per month or per paycheck. That's great. But in reality, you're actually losing. Like you're becoming a less powerful buyer, which is fascinating to me. It's very scary as well. Very scary.
Exactly. And the phrase is you're losing purchasing power. Mm-hmm. You're not able to save anymore. And a civilization, a people, a family need to be able to save. There's this new age, new wave, modern money mindset, which is you have to invest to grow your wealth, to create generational wealth, to be free of inflation. And I believe a lot of that. You need to invest and you need to take risk and be aggressive, but you should also be able to save. A hardworking man should be able to save up for his family, have a little fun for a vacation or putting his family through college or do a home project or be able to own his home and pass down to his kids through generations. And the ability to save is important, and the Federal Reserve central banking is robbing us of that, and I think that's a crime. There's the FDIC, which is this governing body that regulates and insures. FDIC, I think Federal Deposit Insurance. I forget what the C stands for at the end, but essentially, when you open a bank account, you hear that something is FDIC insured, and if you take a look at all of the the dollars in Americans' personal checking accounts right now, most of that is actually not real. If we all went to our bank today and said, I want all my money out of my personal checking account, all the banks, there'd be a bank run, there would be a riot in the streets, people would be rationing food.
It'd be like the Great Depression.
It'd be like the Great Depression or Weimar Germany or Venezuela or other nations that have had hyperinflation and collapsed. What the government does with our value, our dollars that we put into the checking or put into a savings to save for rainy days, they take that out and they give it to other nations. They lend it out at aggressive rates. They have public-private contracts that they just issue for liquidity and for interest gain. And it's not sound and wise financial principles. And to tie that back to your question is, I think there are very strong correlations from principles around Bitcoin to principles in the Bible about financial wisdom, financial sovereignty. The Bible talks about precious metals. Do not store up the treasures where moths rust and thieves break in and steal. Store up things that are sovereign and that cannot be destroyed. So I think Bitcoin is one of those things. If we use Bitcoin the right way, it's something that you and I can transact peer-to-peer. Others can't steal. I don't need to send you a wire that needs to take 2 days to get approved by many institutions in between us. I can transact freely and we can exchange value over space and time together. And I think at the minimum, Bitcoin is better at being gold than gold. You can exchange value over space, physical space, and time via Bitcoin better than you can with gold. If you, Nolan, had a friend in China and you wanted to send them $50 million worth of gold, you'd have to hire a private fleet, an armada. It would take months. You'd potentially risk losing it. If it sunk, you wouldn't get it back. If China said, hey, by the way, Nolan, we're going to seize this armada. This is our gold now. Well, you're screwed. You can send someone $50 million worth of Bitcoin in a matter of minutes for a few dollars in fees, and it's free. You can actually send Bitcoin to and from sovereign citizens in China between the two of yourselves and go around the CCP. And that, I think, is beautiful, and that is free. And I think that adheres to biblical principles.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I want to dive in to that like right after this. I just find this fascinating. The history of central banking in the U.S., this is from the MinneapolisFed.org. It says, a new nation, 1775 to 1790, there was no bank. The first bank was from 1791 to 1811. Not sure why it failed.
So 20 years.
Yeah, 20 years. And then the second bank, pretty much there was a 5-year period, then the second bank started, and that only lasted 20 years too.
Wow.
1836 is when that one failed as well. Then it was a state of free banks, which was basically right up until the Civil War. And then from the Civil War to the 1913, which sounds about right when
right, that's the 19 teens is when we have our modern day founding of the modern day central bank.
That was a period of, quote, national banks. That's fascinating. I didn't know until just now that we had two central banks before. It's fascinating.
Well, the question of what is money, Robert Breedlove has a very famous podcast talking about that question, brings on a lot of bright minds, but that is something we don't even think about. Our programming growing up, we don't even think about what money is. We just know in the U.S. that you got to get the dollar. Well, what gives the dollar value? And many people that are uneducated about the subject say, well, what's the dollar backed by? It's backed by the full weight of the U.S. government. Well, ultimately, what is that? That is their ability to use violence against other territories or other countries or its own citizens. So if you say, I'm going to opt out of this system, well, they ultimately, if you go down the line of threats and punishment and how they enact that, it's through violence. So Bitcoin is something, it's a measure of peace as well. I think we're past the point to which the common argument against Bitcoin is that it's used for money laundering. Well, per capita, per percentage, the U.S. dollar is used to launder more illicit activities than Bitcoin is. Mm-hmm. Drugs, prostitution, illegal activities, murder for hire. That's used by dollars a lot more than it is with Bitcoin. And so we're past that straw man Elizabeth Warren argument that Bitcoin is the criminal's money. It's freedom money and it's peace money.
One thing you just mentioned that stuck out to me is the idea that if the dollar were, if American citizens were to devalue the dollar in their own minds or to stop using the dollar or maybe fill the gap that the dollar has left with another currency, the U.S. government would be significantly more powerless.
Exactly.
Their power would be reduced by multitudes because if how would they pay for their military? How would they pay for their, like, if the taxes didn't mean anything anymore because American citizens were using another currency, that makes a lot of sense too. The reason I bring that up is, the reason it's alarming to me is that makes sense that they would be afraid of it then.
Right.
It makes sense to me that it would be bashed because it's a direct challenge to their power.
Right. And again, to come back to the point in the middle, what I think is helpful is to differentiate being an American patriot and believing in the spirit of America and what it stands for versus the American government, because those two are not the same. The federal government and, wayward, corrupt local governments like Illinois or the state of Illinois, who are, classically known for having corrupt governors and laundering money. I think differentiating the spirit of America and its people versus the government that leads us is very important, because I still believe in the spirit of America. And I believe that the future will actually be better for that. I believe in proper legal immigration. Some of our best and brightest minds, Elon Musk, came from South Africa. So I believe in the American dream still for people to get here legally and to give back. But what that means for the American government, I don't know. You're exactly right. I mean, the idea of the petrodollar, meaning that oil trades globally in the dollar. When we cut Russia off from SWIFT during the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war, SWIFT is the payments processing system that people transact in dollars globally. We cut Russia off from SWIFT. They said, okay, fine. We'll trade with India in rupees. We'll trade with China in yuan. We'll trade with other nations in their own currency. We don't need to trade in the dollar. And so what that did was it showed the world that, okay, while most people still want to trade in dollars because it's still the best fiat currency, other countries are fine without us. So many smart people said, hey, Russia showed that the possibility of the weakening of the petrodollar system is much more near than we think. And so that is an interesting question to think about, to tie that back in, which is, what are Jerome Powell, who runs the Federal Reserve, and folks in the federal government thinking about the ultimate status of the dollar? I struggle sometimes with it. I believe in the power of the West, and I want us to be strong and powerful on a global scale against enemies like Russia and China and India. Not India, but I also struggle with the hyperinflation and the manipulation of the dollar system. So it's another example of seeing benefits on both sides.
A lot of nuance.
Yeah.
Pretty much nuance in everything. You mentioned just now that the American spirit and the American government, I wholeheartedly agree with that 100%. I do think there's a dissonance between the two, or a gap. And I do still believe in the American spirit. That's not a plug for the cigarette, but the American,
could be.
The spirit of America. Yeah, it could be. You mentioned that you believe that the future, it will be better for that. Why, and how does your faith impact that belief and that optimistic outlook or hopeful outlook?
I think I should be a more optimistic person by the faith I hold, and if I'm not, then I think there's a problem there. I probably wouldn't understand Jesus or God well enough to know that in my opinion they've already written the end of the story and that there's hope in that. But the world can be a broken and evil and very sad and pessimistic place, and principles like entropy and Murphy's Law, that became popularized by movies like Interstellar, by the idea that if things can go wrong, they will, things will break down. I think it's easy to see that in business. All these things can spontaneously happen against your business to make a business that's good and has good people behind it fail. And so I think to someone who doesn't have thoughts about faith or God, or is just going about their lives, maybe with nihilism or an agnostic view in the world that maybe God exists, but I don't know how and what, optimism and hope is powerful. It's what caused men to hop in ships and sail across seas facing near certain death. It's what's caused our founding fathers to revolt against the oppression of the crown. It's what's happening now in beautiful ways. It doesn't always get told in mainstream media because fear and negativity sells better than positive stories. But, all around the world, there are positive stories of refugees fleeing and finding homes with people in other countries. And I think there's beauty in that. And so the idea that faith can bring hope and optimism and reconciliation, I consistently believe in that. I also realize that the fabric of American culture feels like it's being eroded, but I also think we need to weigh that against the mammoth influence of the internet. We have 24/7 news cycle. Our inputs can easily be more considered negative than positive versus our social circles decades ago, which was work, which was our local fitness center or a park or families. We were able to weigh these things more critically, positive, negative. If our family members were Republican, Democrat, we could get together at the table and talk it out and work it out and conclude in a hopeful future. But folks are too chronically online, in my opinion. So I think kind of, for lack of a better phrase, going outside and touching grass is helpful for this.
Yeah.
And I derive much of my thoughts about how the world works geopolitically, economically, culturally, socially, from a perspective of faith. I believe in families and people and companies' ability to solve problems. And at some level, I also believe the state can be a helpful ally in that. But I don't think the state is the answer to the solution.
Fascinating. I'm reminded of my favorite book of all time is The Count of Monte Cristo. And on I think it might actually even be like the last paragraph, the last page or 2 pages, he says something to the effect of all human wisdom is found in these 2 words, wait and hope, which I think is pretty profound. I definitely think that there's some, you could say like faithful undertones to that idea. Because I agree with you. Like if you don't have those 2 things, then it's extremely easy to fall into a nihilistic pit. If there is no patience or hope that the patience will pay off, then why wouldn't you be nihilistic? It actually makes logical sense to be nihilistic if there's no hope in the end, if that makes sense.
Right.
So I don't know. I got reminded by that because I think that's a powerful. The power of hope should not be lost on us. I think it's perhaps the most powerful thing.
I think it is too. And even in America culturally, if you're Muslim or if you're Jewish, you don't really celebrate Christmas, but you can recognize the cultural impact it has because when the December month rolls around, our communities, our work, we have parties, we're ripe with hope and anticipation. If you live in a cold weather area when December comes around, even if there's the oppressive cold like there is in the Northeast or in Montana or in the Pacific Northwest, people step out and they're ripe with anticipation and excitement for work parties, for the holidays, for being with family and loved ones. Even if they don't celebrate Christ's birth like someone like myself would, I think we can agree that the month of December culturally is significant because we're waiting and we're hoping to celebrate a new year coming, to celebrate being with family, to celebrate a reset. And there's just this cold, fresh, ripe anticipation in the air in our communities, in our cities. And so I think even if you don't come at it from my faith background, you can recognize that the phrase you just mentioned, wait and hope, is very powerful.
Yeah, I agree. That's an interesting assessment too. I've never really thought about that, where it doesn't really matter what you believe from a faith perspective or don't believe. Generally speaking, the December New Year's is a cheerful time because it's the like the sign of new beginnings. I'm also reminded, I had a conversation with my uncle one time, ironically, talk about Montana, place that I love, holds a very important part of my heart, to be honest. I remember exactly where I was. I was outside of Kalispell, Montana, overlooking the sunrise, literally like it was our Airbnb, probably, I don't know, half a mile of ranch, and then a mountain. I think it was a Mission mountain range. I can't remember. But me and my uncle are sitting there drinking coffee, looking over the sunrise, and I asked him if he likes sunrises or sunsets better. And I journaled it in one of my old journals, but he said sunrises for basically this reason, because it's the proverbial December that you just mentioned, where it's like when the sun rises, there's a hope, there's like this possibility. And I don't know why I just thought about that, but I felt like sharing because I think it's relevant to the idea of like what December and what faith really, how it impacts culture, whether or not you really believe the same.
Right. And something I'd actually like to get your thoughts on is there's a common phrase, which way Western man? And the idea that men need something to strive for. I think there's some good things that can come from that question. Do we have what is the American man's frontier? We're not sailing any seas to find new land anymore. We're not pushing west to find, manifest destiny or the Oregon Trail or promises of gold or beautiful pastures to raise cattle in. We've discovered geographical America. I would love to get your thoughts on what's the modern frontier for the Western man?
That's a phenomenal question. Without thinking too much on it, the first thing that came to my head is family. I don't know if that's right or wrong, but the first thing that it seems to me that there's so many things nowadays that are pushing in the exact opposite. You could say the correlation or the ancient representation of that would have been like the bandits, the Native American tribes that a settler, if you've watched 1883 or something,
sure,
or any of the cowboy movies, like the bandits that you would encounter, the harsh winters, the harsh summers that you would encounter. It feels like those in today's world are like, in the context of family, is like everything in culture. It's like pushing everybody away from the nuclear family. And so in many ways, at least for me, it feels like that's a frontier, because it in many ways feels like it's like becoming unknown. It's becoming like unprioritized and almost discouraged. What are your thoughts? That's a great question.
I like the answer, because that's something that you look inward, right? A man can create on the new frontier with his family from an apartment in Brooklyn, from a ranch in Montana, from a beachside shack in South Florida. He can still create in his family and build something and look to the future with hope through his sons and daughters and communion with his wife. So I think that's definitely a possibility for the modern man. Is a frontier is something actually right at home in your own place that you can build and create in, that you look to the future, a horizon with hope in. So I think that's a good answer. I recently, a very wise man shared the thought with me that if, who are we to be as men? Who are we to look at as an example as men? And my conclusion in that is that the greatest man that ever lived is Jesus, and that there are lots of analogies and allegories for fighting and war and battle. There's also a lot for farming. And so this man shared with me that, the best man ever that ever lived, Jesus, was really a gardener. He was tending, he was pruning, he was sowing, he was reaping, he was, just pouring into something that would give life and create and cultivate. And I do think that's a helpful thought for the Western man who may be prone to his input of the alpha, money Twitter, money social media type male persona, the Andrew Tates of the world. Now, I think Andrew Tate has some helpful concepts and thoughts he shares, but if you look into his origin and a lot of the inflammatory comments he says, I don't think that's necessarily helpful or pushing society forward. So I think a lot of young men are getting that as an input. I think if they turn their gaze towards, maybe to Jesus, and if not Jesus, towards the idea of a cowboy on the Oregon Trail bringing his family west, towards a gardener who just faithfully wakes up and tends his garden, there are, I think, holy principles of tenderness and cultivation in that. To answer the question about what is our frontier, I still believe in the private sector for a man. I still think the internet gives the average person the tools of knowledge to learn and grow and to take a risk on a business or an idea. In the American economy, the American economy still does reward that. Mm-hmm. We can still build. The government may be one thing in our eyes, but when reality comes to it, we still have rules and laws in place where we can innovate and become entrepreneurs really better than any other society. We don't have, communist rulers like China does to maybe prevent free and private enterprise from growing. And we have a system that rewards entrepreneurship. So I think the modern frontier for the man can build and cultivate and grow at home, but he can also step away from his corporate job if he doesn't like that and take a risk with a friend or a trusted partner and build something that'll last there. Because that's the promise of the frontier is not reward. Risk doesn't always mean reward. Many people went down with the ship on their way to the New World and sailing it and traversing it. Many people died on the Oregon Trail. It's not all glory. We just hear the positive stories. So many people will not succeed in creating a new business or chasing that idea. But it's just the idea of the journey and something to build for that is important to humans, not just men. And so I think the question of what's our frontier is helpful. It's helpful to ponder and to muse.
One thing you just said about not necessarily risk not always equaling reward, what just came to mind for me, which I think is, I like the way it sounded in my head. I'm going to try to articulate it. We'll see. The reward for risk is not necessarily reaching the destination or reaching the frontier, wherever you were trying to get to. It's the adventure that's hidden in that, if that makes sense. Because you mentioned like the amount of people that did not make it to the proverbial promised land during Manifest Destiny, or any number of different analogies can be made across war, battles, things of that sort. Business is another example. Not every business that's started by a well-intended, capable human being succeeds. But every business that started at least entails some adventure, which if Jordan Peterson talks about it all the time, it's like telling the truth and living honestly. That's basically equivalent to adventure. So I just found that interesting to bring up.
Right. And there's the biblical principle of sloth being evil. Laziness and pure indulgence and comfort is evil. And if you see, society doesn't naturally at a human level, not necessarily government, but society doesn't reward those who aren't trying to build something or improve their local community or make the state better or make their business or company better. Human action and interaction rewards value creation. And so naturally being slothful or lazy at a minimum isn't going to get you anywhere, and it doesn't lead to anything being better or impacting your family or yourself. There was a quote maybe worth looking up. I forget if it was by St. Augustine, but it was by an influential thought leader in our past who said on his deathbed, "I have offended God by doing so little with my life." I forget who quoted that.
Oh, it was Da Vinci.
Da Vinci.
And think about and he think about that.
Think about all Da Vinci created, and on his deathbed, he's looking back on his life, and he's not brushing himself, patting himself on the back, saying, "I did a good job." He said, "I offended God with doing so little."
I have offended God and mankind because my work did not reach the quality it should have. Da Vinci basically invented flight, human flight. He invented the Vitruvian Man. He was a polymath in every way. He painted the Mona Lisa. That's actually incredible. Not doing enough. That's crazy.
He didn't do enough. And I don't think folks should needlessly strive for the praise of the masses and fame and ambition, because those things are empty. But I think being able to look back on your life and say that you put effort into it with craft, that if you're writing your epitaph, if you're writing what goes on your gravestone, that you crafted it. You crafted your story despite your faults, despite how you came up short, despite how you didn't treat people the way you wanted to treat them all the time, your wife, your children, your family, whoever, your friends, that you sought glory and holiness in greater ordeals. You sought a frontier. You sought something bigger than yourself. I mean, I hear that quote by Da Vinci, and I don't want myself, others to hear that and think, I'm not doing enough. I need to strive. I need to make more money. I think it's not about that. It's more about a way of thinking and being than it is what you have to do.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I remember seeing that quote. I actually think I tweeted about it because I was like, I think I literally said, Da Vinci said this.
Yeah.
Like, that's insane to think about. But the idea that just stuck out to me is that they're like sort of the same deal. Risk is not necessarily always rewarded, just as action is not always, glory is not always the progression of action, but a surefire way to receive, or not receive, but to live a life of glory at all is slothfulness. Like there's no utility or value at all in a life of sloth, which, yeah, I love that. I also love aphorisms. I'm a massive, if anybody who listens to the show or like talks to me in any amount of extended time, I love quotes and aphorisms. And I've been listening to Founders Podcast a ton recently. So 3 that have stuck out to me, it's just interesting. one, Teddy Roosevelt, his life philosophy essentially was 2 words, and it was get action. Number one. Rockefeller said action changes everything. ACE, ACE, action changes everything. Winston Churchill would say this out loud audibly from the time he was like a younger man. Always more audacity. And then I looked up what audacity meant. It's the willingness to take bold risks. So just when I think about stuff like that, in the context of thinking about great men or men that we admire or respect, not a single one of them reached that level of reverence in our heads because they were slothful. It's almost entirely because of a level of action that we admire or respect.
Right. What do you think about where we live? We both live in Austin, Texas. There are some amazing people around here. And I'd like to get your thoughts on that question with a pretext of how interesting of a place it is to live, what people are creating and doing here. In my opinion, the world's greatest entrepreneur, Elon Musk, he lives here. He's moving his companies to the state of Texas and to the city of Austin, South Padre Island for SpaceX. This seems like a hub for those wanting to come do and think and create and take action, to those 3 examples of those 3 amazing men you just referenced. There's one of those people that I think is impacting the city and will have a global impact is a guy named David Perell, founder of Rite of Passage. He runs the How I Write podcast. But 2 years ago, he wrote an article about what's up with Austin. Everyone knows that it's this kind of weird city, that interesting people live there, people love to visit. But what's up with it culturally? For those of us that live here like you and I do, Nolan, what's going on here? Where's it going? And I thought it was interesting to read his article about that 2 years ago, which was written in the summer of 2022. And then today, what's going on. For those listening, I'd definitely have referenced David's work in reading that article. But what do you think about Austin and the future for what it can be, and maybe why or why not someone should move here, move their business here, their family? What do you think about this place long term?
That's another really good question. I appreciate you flipping the script. The first thing that comes to mind is the idea that Squatch Gym, which is a gym I've gone to, for all its shortcomings, is a very cool place. I think it's a very unique place. And what I would tell people all the time, I mean, it's actually interesting. So 2 days from now would be a year since I left my first stint in Austin, when I was sleeping on my brother and his wife's hardwood floor for 2 months. That was a year ago. And I knew from, like, as soon as I moved here, I was like, okay, this place is unique because I'm from Atlanta. I've lived in a handful of different states across the eastern side of the United States. What I would tell people is that the gym I go to is a good example. If I went to Squatch or you went to Squatch, the likelihood of you getting in the sauna and having a conversation with somebody who's at least doing something interesting, or not at least doing something that's doing something that wouldn't spark some level of intrigue or interest, is pretty low. And I don't think that's the case for a lot of places. And it's probably not the case for all of Austin either, but I like the analogy of Austin being the Renaissance, or the Florence of the American Renaissance.
Florence or Athens, Greece, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I really do believe that, because when you think about what you're just mentioning, the world's leading entrepreneur, some of the biggest companies in the world are coming to Texas. So so from a business perspective, everybody's coming to Texas. Mm-hmm. Not everybody. Lots of people and important players in the business world are coming to Texas. The largest media, the most important media source in probably the world, or one of them in the world, Joe Rogan, lives and moved willingly to Austin. Comedy, which is an art form, Austin. Bitcoin, massive hub in Austin. Jiu-jitsu and martial arts, massive hub in Austin. And these are all relatively new additions, or what would you say, it's new that Austin is the hub of these things, but I don't think it's a coincidence that all of them are happening at the same time. So that being said, I think you have art, you have media, you have business, you have Bitcoin, which is very much so, you could say, aligned with like the political arena. You have all these things that are intersecting in a city that that's in the middle of a state that represents freedom, the freedom frontier in America in many ways. So I think it's an incredible place. Whether or not I live here full time for the rest of my life, yet to be decided. Sure. I can tell you right now that this is a fascinating place. The amount of people that I've met in Austin, you being one of them, that are genuinely interesting people that are leaving a mark on the world, it's more than I can count. So that's my thoughts. I think it's a fascinating place.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a politically blue, left-leaning city in a big red state of Texas. And I think there's a lot of great cultural immersion there. There are places built and created essentially in the vein of the Roman Forum, places where people can come and exchange ideas. In Austin specifically, there's the Sapien Center, which is a place where speakers come in to give thoughts on, esoteric topics or common topics via a new lens. There's a venture capitalist entrepreneur named Evan Baer, a very successful, smart man who just opened up a concept called Arena Hall, where you can become a member, and he brings in speakers. He brought in Brian Johnson a few weeks ago.
Liver King or the Zero guy?
The Don't Die guy, who's trying to live forever, yeah. So regardless of what you think of Brian Johnson, he was a successful venture capitalist prior to this new venture.
Didn't he help start Venmo or something?
I think he worked at Venmo, yeah.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure he helped found Venmo, which is pretty fascinating.
That's no small feat. So, regardless of what you think of Brian Johnson and his endeavors, Evan brought him in to speak. Elon's popping up around town speaking at events. There's all these little cultural nodes, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum. You could be the most, red-blooded conservative. We need to go back to Ronald Reagan, or you could be the most, blue liberal. We need, Bernie Sanders to be our next president. And you can come together in the middle, hear interesting thoughts, and engage in discourse. And I just appreciate that very much. To the earlier point of someone who believes in the spirit and patriotism of America. I don't think that being an American patriot is exclusive of any one political bit of thought. I think it's interesting. If you look at what's considered crazy left-leaning liberal hippies, 1969 Woodstock type, I identify with a lot of those politics. They wanted small government. They were advocates for freedom. They were anti-war. If I was a youth, I would have probably been holding some of those same signs. And so I think the modern Democratic Party has strayed a bit too far to one end. Trump has obviously riled up some far-right personas and ideals that are not helpful. And so I think just bringing things into the middle of a healthy, productive forum of discussion is a place that Austin serves well to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to correct the Brian Johnson thing. I think he sold a company to Venmo.
Oh, okay.
But just wanted to make sure that was clear. But I agree with you. I think there's this idea that I've tried to grapple with it. I don't think I'm articulating it super well, but because I think it's a pretty foundational idea. But I think about it a lot. When you think about what truth is, Matthew McConaughey in Green Lights talks about the mandorla, the mandorla, however you pronounce it. It's like an almond shape. It's essentially, if you look at a Venn diagram, it's the middle. It's where two overlap. Another way of describing that is the paradox. Like it's the place where two seemingly unrelated things are related. I believe that the truth is in that area. The truth, the most true things are the things that humans can't intellectualize. Yes. That's what makes them the most true, if that makes sense. I don't know if this is making any sense. In my head, I'm still wrapping up, trying to figure out how to actually articulate this idea or this thought. But the reason it's relevant to this is Austin, like you said, it's the place. It's not like a San Francisco, California, where there's crazy cool tech stuff going on that's the hub of all that. But you go to a gym in San Francisco and try to have a political argument and espouse any beliefs that are not pretty far left, you're going to be thrown out of the sauna.
Right.
Go to rural Texas is a good example. Rural Alabama, rural South, rural wherever. You're going to probably have the exact opposite. Austin's a unique place in that you're exactly right. It's dead smack in the middle of a very red state, but it's a blue city. And like I said, there's all these extremely powerful players in a lot of different arenas that are convening here. So it's the reason I said it's the geographical paradox in my opinion right now. So that's why I like it.
There's a very wise man with a popular podcast. His name is Marty Solomon. He's the host of the Bema podcast. He talks about the difference between the Eastern way of thinking and the Western way of thinking. And so the way that you and I grew up thinking, Nolan, is Western thought derived from ancient Greece on how we govern, on how we think, on how we act economically, what we do culturally. That's different than, the East. The Jews of the Bible, folks in Asia, how they think through oral story, and story matters more instead of the who, what, how, when, where, why questions that we ask in the West. Marty talks about the concept of chiasms in the Bible, and what a chiasm is. It's a literary device used by an author to convey themes that invert and fulfill themselves over time. So it goes in the format of A, B, B, A. And in the Bible, the Old Testament, the prophets had prophecy A. Christ came in theme B, talked about what he was doing again in his life and in his ministry in theme B again. And then in the end, theme A, he says that I've come to fulfill the law, not abolish it. So the law was the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, and the prophets. So Christ said he came to fulfill the law and the prophets, which is all the Old Testament, as a new sacrifice, Jesus' life and sacrifice, but he didn't come to abolish it. And so that's a chiasm, the story of Jesus' life, A, B, B, A. And so that's a cool example of an Eastern way of thinking and story, and kind of a cousin of a paradox, if you will.
Yeah, that's what my mind just went to.
And Austin, in a way, is that. It's red, it's blue, it's got art, it's got hard tech. AI chip manufacturing companies are building fabs, which are these large facilities to do these hard manufacturing tasks of hard technology. You've got software here. You've got some oil and gas companies. South by Southwest comes by in the spring, which is a hub of the art and media and entertainment world. You got ACL in the fall, which is the biggest music festival. So Austin is a paradox. It is a chiasm, and I think the world's best and brightest and most interesting have just naturally been drawn to that over time. It happened in Istanbul, in Hong Kong, in Athens, in Florence, in London, in Paris, and then New York, and then LA, and then SF, and then now Austin is one of those. When maybe some of those prior cities don't maintain the polarization that they once had to make it the chiasm, to make it the paradox. Maybe they skewed too far one way like SF did with a more kind of liberal, left-leaning approach. I would assume cities like Istanbul or Athens maybe became too on the right side of the spectrum in terms of their beliefs, as more archaic, older European cities who are more traditional in their thinking. So this Eastern-Western dynamic is so fascinating because you can think about it in a literal sense based on geography. Where you were born, you can make assumptions about what someone thinks and how they are and how they act. Now the internet is kind of breaking a lot of that, and that general trend is still there, but it allows those to learn and know and think freely.
Fascinating. The chiasm is a word I've never heard that before, but that's awesome. I'm gonna look into that. One thing that we talked about this recently too, like the bell curve. That's pretty much what it is. It's like A, B, B, A. It's the bell curve. We talk about that meme where it's like
right.
the under intellectualized, the dumb person thinks a thing, and there's this middle ground of a person where it's like, no, this is it. And then you reach a point where you're like, oh, wait, actually, it was this all along.
Conclusion.
And one example of that I just thought about from a biblical perspective is like the return to childlike faith. Like we're children. We are dumb. We're ignorant of the world. We become adults. And then like through our adulthood, the goal then becomes to return to childlike. I don't know if that would be an example of a chiasm or something like that, but like that whole idea, I really like that because I think there's a lot of lessons like that of reaching a certain understanding of a thing that makes you realize that you were almost right all along, right? Like this is what I mean. Like we can't. I really genuinely believe, and we'll see if this proves to be correct. I'm 25 years old and pretty dumb, relatively, but
I would disagree with that.
I don't think that we're gonna be. I don't think we can intellectualize truth. Like I think that's why the middle ground is wrong. Like the person that doesn't know that there's any more, like the Dunning-Kruger effect, I think is like when you realize, what is it like when you know, have you heard of that?
I've heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect, maybe.
Yeah, this is a Google, because the example I always give is my jiu-jitsu coach got a black belt and he'd been doing jiu-jitsu for like 9 years and his coach was like, welcome to jiu-jitsu. And he's like, what do you mean welcome to jiu-jitsu? I've been doing, whoa, hold up. But it's like the more that you know, the more that you realize you don't know, I think. I'm going to look it up just to make sure. But that's what that kind of reminds me of the chiasm.
And I saw I saw Robert Breedlove interview Jordan Peterson at the Bitcoin conference in Miami in 2022, and that was just a great conversation back and forth. But Peterson said that truth is the end of inquiry. And many thinkers and also religions get caught up in, either endless inquiry and ignoring initial foundational truths of humans, or, obviously in the example of Buddha, the goal is to reach a certain level of enlightenment and reach nirvana. I like the idea of truth being the end of inquiry, but to your earlier point, I think some things about our world, our existence, creation, and ultimately God are a mystery. And that is where things get very exciting and fun to talk about, is to what degree are we bumping up against the roof of our fallible human brains? Where are we not looking, or where should we be looking that we aren't? And that's why I think this Bema podcast by Marty Solomon, bridging the East and Western way of thinking, taking the best of both, and thinking about creation and the story of humankind and ultimately God and all of that, it's such a fun and fascinating journey because we get the best of the way the Eastern way thinks. We can understand the Bible as it's how it's written and who it's written to, which is to the Eastern people. We can reconcile that with our existence as Western men living here in Texas in 2024, and we can inform our lives and our action by that to a degree that's helpful, but also to the bell curve meme, to the theme of the chiasm, not in a way that's just a useless, squabbling, armchair academic in perpetuity. We can know that certain things will always be a mystery. We won't ever reach a full end point of knowing all the doctrine, of having all the right answers. That is, I think, a helpful thought for me on how I live my life daily, that I won't ever know everything, that some things are a mystery. And that makes sense if you look at the way God created us. If he is outside of space and time, if he's a metaphysical God, then we won't know everything about his story and about who he is. But maybe we will one day.
That's like a really important idea, I think, because I think that's one idea that I've thought about before is the idea of faith being of no use in a sterile environment. The only place or environment where faith would be of any utility or any need is in the wilderness. What I think happens is human beings try to intellectualize themselves into a sterile environment so that they have the perception of control and of understanding. But in reality, I think that's a fool's errand, because I don't think it's possible. You need faith to fill that gap. Does that make sense? Like, the way that I perceive it is like a hunter and gatherer. If I don't know where my food's going to come from, the only reason that I would go across the next mountain range to find food is faith that there would be food there.
Yeah.
And this is why they were so much more spiritually active and devout in whatever way they were than human beings now. We live at large in an atheistic society. And I think that's part of the reason, because we become more sterile. We don't have wilderness. And when you're chomping at the bit to get your next cup of water or your next meal, it takes a lot more faith to take that next step. It takes a lot more hope to take that next step than in today's world, where there's like, what wilderness do we have? That's another reason. This may be a good segue that I didn't even think about, to your recent trip into the wilderness. Like, that's a reason why that's such an important thing to do as a man specifically. Like, go put yourself in those places, put yourself in the act, like not even just the proverbial wild, like put yourself in the legitimate wild. I think that's super important. If you wanted to talk about that, I would love to expound on that a little bit more.
Absolutely. About a week ago, I went into the wilderness to do a 24-hour period of fasting from human interaction, from my phone and any screens, and from food. So essentially, I took my water bottle, went to a friend's plot of land down south outside of Austin, and just got away. I'd been wanting to do this for a long time. Fasting, even if you don't have a faith component, fasting can be practically good for you. I think if you do one 72-hour water-only fast in your life, the studies show that drastically reduces your risk of cancer. So obviously do your own research. Every individual body is different, but fasting is a net good just as a human. I think there's a spiritual component to fasting as well. That's why I went out into the wilderness. But I've been wanting to do this for a while. Almost every man I respected and all the stories in the Bible talked about the spiritual practice of fasting. And Jesus says in Matthew, when you fast, not if you fast. And so I felt like I had been ignoring or disobeying that, and I needed to obey that. If I believe Jesus is the greatest man that ever lived, I want to follow him, and I want to do what he says and what's good and true and beautiful. And so I got away. I'd hoped for a spiritual, supernatural encounter. I'd hoped for a divine dream or a vision or a way to encounter God, maybe of biblical proportions, maybe not. Maybe just what he will do for those of us living in modern times where I still believe spiritual miracles exist in the ways that the Lord gives them, because he loves to give gifts. But I didn't get any of those. I didn't get a dream. I didn't get a vision. What I got was something I think just as sweet, but in a different way, is I read the scriptures of the Bible in a new and different light, and I felt like they nourished me. There's a scripture that says, man cannot live on bread alone. To your early point about the book, we can live with weeks without food, even water. So we know we can go long times without these things we think we need every 4 hours. So that concept in the Bible, man cannot live on bread alone, I think it's talking about faith and believing in Jesus in that place. And so in my time in the wilderness, I wanted to get away and to, in my opinion, commune with God, and to, one, my stomach would growl and I would think about myself and my needs, go into the scriptures and see if anything was revealed to me. See if I saw them in a new light, because I grew up, I went to a classical Christian school. We read the Bible. We read the whole Bible. We often memorized big parts of the Bible. But as a kid, I didn't have a compass to internalize that and give it meaning. So it felt like school, and the habit ultimately died. Now as an adult, thinking for myself, not needing to do it, I want to do it more. And so the scriptures came alive. And I think time dwelling in the scriptures, daily, every couple of days, weekly, with others, with a men's group, with your women's group, at your church, it will bring fruit. I think that is a promise of Jesus. It will bring fruit, and over time, spending time with a verse or a book will illuminate the scriptures. And so for me, that time in the wilderness, it was only 24 hours. I plan to do a 72-hour one, hopefully fairly soon, but was a net positive as a human for the fasting aspect, to deplug from screens and from human interaction, to be in nature, to not eat. So at the minimum, I got those benefits. At maximum, I got to see the writings of the greatest book of all time in a new and a different way. Another great article by David Perel, local Austinite, is called Why You're Christian, and talks about the foundation of the West being built on the scriptures in the Bible. And so even if you hate religion, or you've been harmed by someone at church, or you find yourself thinking that the state can save us, that's fine, and I respect your thoughts, but read the Bible out of simple curiosity, and you may see it revealed to you in a new and a different way, because Jesus does have some pretty apolitical truths that are good and fruitful to live by. And I think I got that in my time, just spending time with the Word, and zero modern day conveniences or even food.
Yeah, that's super powerful. And you obviously shared some stuff about that at the first appointment, which was awesome. It's, once again, not something that a lot of people do. Not a lot of people and not a lot of men do that. A, either fast in general, B, do it for a spiritual reason, and C, actually get into the wilderness to do it. And I think it's in Matthew, maybe it's all across the Gospels, but didn't Jesus go to the wilderness to pray often?
Often.
Yeah.
Often. He withdrew frequently.
Withdrew, that's a great word.
Yeah. And, if you've ever been to Israel, there's just this beautiful nature in northern Israel around the Sea of Galilee where the real man Jesus was born and lived and walked. And Israel is, the size of the country, or the state of New Jersey. So the Bible all kind of happened in that greater Israel, Middle East area, in a small general square radius. And you can go there and you can see the places where he withdrew to that are very beautiful, and you can see why he did, because they were beautiful and they were peaceful. And I think as a modern day man, I study finance. I have a numbers analytical mindset. A self-critique recently has been, I need to create. It's good for people to create. And often a lot of people create, they're content creators. So they're creating videos and posts and media. I think that can be helpful. I was thinking about what I can create, and I needed to get away to get that revelation. In the book of Exodus, there's a story of this man. It's not kind of commonly known, but his name is Bezalel. And God gave him his Holy Spirit and gave him wisdom and gave him skills to craft the Ark of the Covenant, which was what they stored the tabernacle of God, the Ten Commandments in. And the Israelites carried it with them throughout persecution in the wilderness and the Exodus and in Egypt, back to the Holy Land, back to the Temple of Solomon. The Ark of the Covenant was commissioned by God to Bezalel to carry the story of the Israelites. And so when I think about that story of Bezalel, God gave him amazing gifts. He gave this man, it said, the craftsmanship to work with gold and silver and bronze to create the Ark of the Covenant. And he gave him the wisdom and the Holy Spirit of God. So I think that's good for humans and men and women to spend time thinking on is, I like to ask, seek, and knock for the gifts of the Holy Spirit and for wisdom and for the ability to create. And so I like to encounter God for the Holy Spirit and for wisdom, but I also want to create. I want to create here in Austin, Texas, because it's an amazing place to do that. And whether that's with gold, silver, bronze, or computer code, or hardware engineering, or cars, or spaceships, people can create in Austin, and I think that's a cool opportunity.
If we are made in the image of the Creator, does that not mean we were made to create? That's a powerful idea that I've had before, because I think it's spot on. I won't even add anything to that. I agree with you. I think we should be creating all the time, and I think it's interesting you have the awareness to understand that you're a analytical, like numerically inclined person, but to understand that you can still create. I have a buddy who who works in a finance job, but has the same level of awareness. So he started an endeavor that basically acted as a way for him for his creative muscle to not atrophy. Because what happens a lot of times, I think it is a muscle. You work these, like you go to college, you get institutional. You go to high school, institutionalized. College, institutionalized. Corporate job, institutionalized. There's zero creativity, or at least minimal at that. And over time, that muscle dwindles, that ability dwindles. I was just fascinated by what you just said, and him and several other friends as well who have noticed the situation that they're in, and then actively implemented ways in their life for that muscle to not atrophy, which I think is super important. One question, and I don't mean for this to be oversimplified, but in your words to you, what does it mean to believe in Jesus?
To believe in Jesus is to follow him and have faith like that sunrise. There's a C.S. Lewis quote about the sunrise, that Jesus' promises are good and true. And while I've never met the physical man that was Jesus, although he was a real man who lived, science and tales can prove it, I believe that he was really the Son of God. And he performed miracles. And he died to reconcile humankind from its distance between God. And so what does that look like practically in my life? It looks like shunning religion, shunning legalism, shunning the Western vertical factory of thought that I was trained and programmed in, and seeking to follow Jesus via wisdom and via the Holy Spirit. Be in community. Find a church. Not all churches are perfect. Mine's not. If you look for a perfect church, you're going to spend your entire life wondering for it. And if you don't want to go to church, if you think you can have faith a part of that, that's fine. Seek a community of people that'll build you up. Find online digital community. Listen to the Bema podcast by Marty Solomon. Get out in the wilderness and read the Bible and ask God to reveal it to you. I think a personal relationship with Jesus is just following him and seeking his face, because I think Jesus loves to give gifts. He loves to give knowledge or discernment or spiritual gifts. So, not to get into that too much, but I think at minimum, inquiry into Jesus' life and what he said is worth it. In the West, we like to think we're enlightened, and we talk about, Buddha and other gods and New Age spiritualisms and wisdom of that. I think it's fine to have inquiry into that, but if you're going to do that, consider the person of Jesus as well. And I think you'll find at the end of your inquiry the conclusion that this man was either one of two things. He was either a crazy man and a lunatic when he lived, or he actually was who he said he was. And he was the Son of God incarnate, and he came to fulfill the Old Testament and to bring man back to communion with God. And I think that is a foundational truth that in our physical, science-based world, we can see that there are inklings of that. We see how animals know we're different. If we're in a relationship with an animal and you have a dog at home or a cat or you herd sheep, that animals look at you differently. Even dolphins, who are the smartest animal in the world, there are all these videos on the internet of them communicating with us and recognizing our God-given dominion. So humans are net different than animals. And I don't think that's just some evolutionary one-off, just chance growth. We didn't come from the same thing. I think, like Tucker Carlson and Joe Rogan explored recently, that, it's pretty proven that Darwinian theory, as we were taught in schools, has a lot left to be desired. And even Elon Musk, in his recent interviews with Jordan Peterson and Tucker Carlson, and in Elon's own philosophical inquiry, he recognizes that if Jesus is real, I like to be saved. I like to know Jesus. And if Elon Musk ever hears this, I think Jesus would like to know you as well. So it's a long way of answering your question, Nolan, but I just think at the very minimum, if you've been hurt by church, if you think this whole thing is bullshit, look at the teachings and the writings of Jesus and the stories of him, and I think you will be touched. And you will know that this person is a good person. At the very minimum, follow him and do what he says, and your life will improve. You will love your neighbor well. You will love your family well. You will leave a lineage and a legacy of impact, better than just seeking New Age Western wisdom and knowledge, than reading that next self-help book, than seeking out another TED Talk or another general self-help podcast. Follow Jesus, and his teachings and his knowledge are rich with wisdom for your life.
That's a great answer. That's profound. I'll probably go back and listen to that. That leads to mind another question about Jesus. One thing that we've discussed at other points as well, but the idea, because I want to preface this by saying people conflate, often in my experience, myself included at certain times in my life, people that I've communicated with conflate religion and Jesus. Like the legalistic
Sure.
Nature of religion and the teachings of Jesus, which I think is, I'm not a fan of religion. Doesn't sound like you are either. I think in Beautiful Outlaw by John Eldridge, he calls it like the poison of religion or something like that. And the interesting thing that when I think about the Bible is that Jesus came to basically convict it was the religious people, not the non-religious people, which I think is an interesting thing to explore. The question though is, you say shunning religion, shunning these other things, these programmings. What does it mean, like when you believe in Jesus, what does it mean to have like a personal relationship with him? This is something I've heard you speak about before, and obviously it's something that's core to your life and like ethos as a human. What does that mean to you to have a personal relationship with Jesus?
That's a hard one, because many people only believe what they can deduce with their empirical senses, what they can see, what they can smell, taste, feel, touch, our physical world. And that's why it's important. I guess I could understand if someone who doesn't believe in God is weighing God against the physical world. They haven't seen God, or they say they haven't been able to encounter God. Maybe in their most strict way of thinking and living, that might be true. I think you can see God in the physical via his creation, via nature, via supernatural encounters and spiritual warfare, which is maybe a time for the next podcast we're on, or we do together. But that's why it's important to distinguish. God is greater than just the physical space. He created it. So he is metaphysical. He is both outside of and above, and also in the physical space. So he's not limited to our thought of him or our physical dimension. And so it's often hard if you're just judging him just based on the physical. If you don't think creation and nature is designed by God, you can think, oh, I don't see God anywhere. God is dead. Nietzsche says God is dead. But I think if you pray to Jesus, if you ask him into your life, if you read his writings and his stories, he will become real and alive to you, just like his word says he is. In your worst times, if you're hearing this and if you're suffering right now, if you're having a hard time with family, work, if you're depressed, ask Jesus to come and sit in your pain with you and to be with you, and I know that he will. If people that ask, seek, and knock and cry out to God, I believe you will find him, and I believe that's absolute. And if you are not having that encounter on your own, if you can't seem to see or know Jesus on your own, reach out to us on this podcast. Reach out to someone in your community who has maybe talked to you about faith before, or you look up to and respect them, or who maybe lives different or has that glow on them that you just know they look different. We all have people like that in our lives. So if you're hearing this and you think God is not real, you can't see, touch, taste, feel God, or you don't have a personal relationship with Jesus, you're struggling to do that, spend time alone in wilderness and pray and ask for that. If you ask, seek, and knock, I think God will reveal himself to you. And if he doesn't choose to do that in one instance, keep asking, keep seeking, keep knocking, keep praying, and use your community as a way of doing that, because I do believe Jesus reveals himself to us when we're gathered. The Bible says when two or more are gathered in your name, pray, and his Holy Spirit will come to you. So it's something that is not easily answered in a who, what, how, when, where, why way of thinking, that Western way of thinking. I just think it's a spiritual journey. It is not going to be found by checking off your attendance in church on Sunday. I don't think you're going to, earn and know and find your way to God through that, or to Jesus through that. But I think if you ask Jesus into your life, he does come into your life. He wants to come into your life, and he will, because he promised that he will. So I believe that it's open to everyone to encounter Jesus, and he will encounter you.
Did you grow up in, have you ever been sort of have you been down the real legalistic religious route before? Have you experienced that way of living?
I have.
What changed? What was the impetus of change, or the catalyst for change?
I just look at this. If you look at the Gospels and Jesus, and even folks who are the most religious and most legalistic in the Christian faith will say that faith in Jesus is the way to heaven. They're so concerned with the wrong things. They're concerned with their own salvation. They're so concerned by the end game of getting to heaven. And for me, that's more animism. Animism is the fearful worship of spirits. That's the rural Amazonian tribe that fearfully offers child sacrifices or prayer to a God they don't know because they're afraid of what he will do to them. I think God is much greater than the afterlife for us. I think if we live life in faith in Jesus, we will commune with God after our life, but I don't think that's the chief concern of our life. And so I think when I saw that these people were so worried about arguing and debating people into faith, I never saw that work. I studied abroad in London one semester in college, and I had a great random park bench conversation with a Muslim one day. And it was just general inquiry of me asking about his life and his experience with his faith in Allah and the Prophet Muhammad and his upbringing in the Middle East. And we came away as better people. I don't think I convinced him to follow Jesus. That wasn't really my goal. I would like him to know Jesus, but we talked like two human beings, and that was a net gain, a fruitful conversation. So I found that these people in the West that care so much about attaining knowledge and gaining the right doctrine and arguing people into proper salvation, I just don't think that's helpful. I think Jesus went into the unholy places. He hung out with the woman at the well, prostitutes, sinners, people cast out, the Gentiles, people who at the time of Jesus, the ruling class, the Pharisees, the Jews of that time, the Romans, all would point at them and say, those are outsiders. They're unclean. They're bad. We don't go there with them. And so I think there are similarities today to religious people in the West, whether they're Christian religious people or Jewish religious people or Muslim religious people. They exile and they push people away instead of bringing them in. There are so many instances in the life of Jesus where he brought the outsider in. People asked for healing. He healed them. They came to him, he preached to them. They came to him and they were hungry, he fed them with bread and with fish. He very rarely, if any, to my knowledge of the Gospels in his life, would just outright reject a person without asking them a good question back first or getting to know their story. And so I believe that if you came and encountered the physical man, the person of Jesus when he was here a few thousand years ago, you would have known surely that he was God.
What a thing that would have been.
And I think that 99.9% of people that have ever lived won't go to Israel, to the beautiful Sea of Galilee, to the mount where he preached the Sermon on the Mount. But it is a fun thing to do if you have the means and the ability to go. I don't need to go to Israel to see where Jesus lived to believe and see with my own eyes. But man, it makes some things really interesting.
Yeah, we talked about that recently. That's on the bucket list for sure. I can imagine talk about like an aura or like just a pervading spirit, I guess. I mean, I can't imagine actually walking the same road. I think you mentioned when the lady reached out and grabbed his robe, there's a painting or something like that. Like just seeing that type of stuff and walking the same roads, standing on the same mounts, that's probably a pretty profound experience. But I'm reminded by another quote, one of my favorites. St. Francis of Assisi said, "Preach the gospel always, and if necessary, use words." I love that idea. I'm reading War and Peace right now, and literally today, a character in the book had this revelation after a long time in captivity that basically no man's opinion or convictions will be changed through words. And he's like, the realization is like this freedom that he has now. He's like, oh, wow. I don't have to like try to articulate articulate myself so well that this person believes exactly what I believe or whatever. It just gave him this freedom, which I think the irony or maybe the counterintuitive nature of that is that makes it more compelling to be like, wait, what's this guy?
Right.
Wait, what's going on with this guy? He's not trying to convince me. He's not trying to tell me how to live. It's just a fascinating idea.
He's living, and his action. Back to your point about those three men, about Roosevelt, about Rockefeller, about the third was?
Rockefeller, Winston Churchill.
About Churchill. Those guys were action-based. And Jesus was the most action-based. He physically put himself down and low and beneath to show people that it's not about being above and being the ruling religious class. The night before he died, he washed the feet of all of his disciples. He did something that was so unclean in the eyes of the ruling class to show them that it's actually through servant leadership and putting yourself lowly that you are exalted. And that is a common tune with Scripture. So the idea that just Christ, again, to the chiasm, to the paradox, put himself down, and that God came to us and died for us. If you look at other, quote, religions, that's not a common theme there. You're earning to God. You have to have this path of enlightenment to climb and get to God. I did a study abroad in Asia and went to Angkor Wat, the temple in Cambodia. And these amazing, magnificent temples were made, and they were created with such difficulty. The stones were carved and chiseled with narrow edges so that you would have to climb really hard to get to the temple, and that was your reward. And I think there's practical benefits of that, but that's not how I believe Jesus and the Father and the Holy Spirit, God, interacts with us. Jesus became accessible through his death on the cross. I don't think he wants us to have this long, winding, hard road to faith. Faith comes with a cost, but he's not waiting to see us perform for it. So, back to your question about religion, Jesus says that this is true religion, to care for the widows and the orphans. And I don't care if you're a Christian church or a Jewish synagogue or a Muslim mosque. I think if you're practicing religion well, you're doing those things. You're bringing in the sick and caring for them. You're feeding the poor. Back to the earlier point about the state, I don't think that's actually the state's job. I think churches and other religious organizations need to step up and be involved in their community. And that's another reason I like Austin, Texas, is because I see that happening. I see people of different faiths interacting with the less than in the community, those who have less, and loving them and giving them things they need. And Jesus told us, you can't call yourself religious and not give to the widows and the orphans at the very bare minimum. He was saying this to the Pharisees and to the religious people of the time. So he said, if you're going to abide by this, at least care for the widows and the orphans. And so I just think a lot of people in the West aren't doing that. We're this physical space where we show up to check a box and feel good about ourselves on Sundays and know something new. But if a weak woman with 2 orphan children came in, would they be well received, or would they be stared at, and would they be whispered about and gossiped about? The kind of church I want to be a part of is one that welcomes those people in. Or if a woman, a young mother who has an abortion, is going through a hard time in life, I want to bring her in. And I think Jesus, by his life, did that with all the people he interacted with.
Yeah, that's a pivotal point, I believe. There's this, from like a legalism and Christ standpoint, I think they're, what would you say? Like, not diametrically opposed, but I think they maybe actually are, now that I say it. They're polar. And our mutual friend Cole mentioned one time that he's almost more reluctant to describe himself as a Christian and more as a Christ follower. I found that to be a profound paradigm shift, because inherent in my understanding of the word Christianity or Christian is the religious and legalism associated with it. That's whether or not I'm alone in that is, I guess, yet to be determined. But the idea of not following the legalism or the religion or the doctrine or the dogmatism or whatever it is, but actually following the man and the Son of God that is Jesus, that's significantly more appealing to me. And I actually think that that's the main thing. I think like the legalism is, that saying where it's like, keep the main thing the main thing.
Right.
I think that's keeping the secondary or the periphery in the primary focus, whereas the idea of following Christ is much more correctly oriented, I guess.
And that is why I think it's important for us to be open-minded to that, because as much as we like to say the Pharisees were bad and religious people are bad, these were actually mainly really good people at the time. They followed the law the best. They followed God's commandments, or tried to, and they cared about keeping the law. And when Jesus came, that's why it was kind of hard for them to wonder, is this really the Son of Man? Is he here to fulfill the prophecies of Isaiah and fulfill the law and not abolish it? And that's, I think, an interesting question. If you and I, Nolan, are walking on South Congress and Jesus showed up, if we were still obeying the law, would we be open-minded and able to renew our mind and follow him? And that's what I think is key, is there is a spiritual component of the city of Austin. There are folks who like to, do microdosing retreats or breathwork classes or be open to yoga. All of these things have spiritual components. And I think some of them can be helpful actions for what it can do physically for your body, but ultimately I think they are all spiritual things. And I think that if we take these spiritual things and recognize them for what they are, Jesus is above all of that. So it's an interesting question to think about. If Jesus came to Austin today, would we be able to do what he says, which is renew our mind in him, or would we do other things that modern society says is good, which is, hey, empty your mind. Empty your mind via drugs, empty your mind via sex, empty your mind via entertainment, empty your mind via enlightenment. Do we want to do that, or do we want to renew and refresh and rebuild our minds? I think that's an interesting question to consider. If Jesus was here in Austin, what would he say about that?
We discussed this at breakfast the other day, I believe, too, about the idea of I think it's a Greek story with when the gods visited the people. And my friend, it reminds me of my friend. He's the one who told me the story, and it's very much so core to how he lives his life. I think that's an interesting parallel where like the Greek gods basically visited. I know you're already familiar, but the Greek gods visited the earth to check on humans, see what they're doing, see what's up. I think it was like Zeus and let's say Hermes or Apollo. I don't know. But they visited the earth and they were rejected by everybody. They disguised themselves as beggars and homeless people, essentially. And they went around from house to house asking if they could have shelter or food or whatnot. And I think the story goes like the last family they checked on was a very poor family. And the family opened the door, let them in, gave them wine, killed a calf, and like basically celebrated and hosted them with as much extravagance as they could muster. And as a reward, the gods gave them, like, rewarded them. They were like, wow, thank you so much for being hospitable. I think that's an interesting story to relate to what you're just saying. Like, if we were walking down South Congress and saw Jesus, what would we do?
Would we bring him in and serve him wine and the fatted calf? That's such a strong symbol and a story, because there's a verse from Romans 12:1 that says to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God. It now is the Bible advocating for child sacrifice? No. What it's saying is that your body is a temple, to manage it and to keep it well. And it also has a spiritual component to that aspect, your body, saying, hey, sacrifice your spiritual life, put down yourself, pick up your cross, follow Jesus, and you will get your reward. It comes with a cost. This is how you should upkeep it and present your body as a sacrifice. The idea of sacrificing yourself for something better. and laying down your own life, is a good and healthy concept that Jesus crystallizes in his life and his teachings. And then in Romans, in Paul's letter to the Romans, he points to that as well. So I think, Jesus asked a person one time, would you not take the fatted calf, the healthy calf, and sacrifice that for guests? Or would you take a sick and old and frail calf for your guests? So we should then try and, in my opinion, live a healthy and vital and energetic life with our physical bodies so that our emotional and our spiritual bodies will be in check too, that we can serve Jesus better. And if you don't believe in faith and don't believe in Jesus, keep your body like a temple and put into it what you want to get out of it.
Right on. I agree. Dude, this has been awesome. I think we're right under 2 hours. Such a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate you coming on and being just being able to articulate what it is that you believe and your ideas clearly. That's a skill, but I also think it's a service to humanity to be able to do that and to take the steps necessary to be able to cultivate that skill, because it helps other people like myself learn and be able to understand things better. So thank you for that. Thank you for, like I said in the beginning, living the way that you do and living with the conviction that you do. I really appreciate it, man.
Nolan, you're a great interview, a great conversationalist. You care. You have a sense of curiosity and inquiry, and that's why you will get what you want out of this process of inquiry via the podcast, via interacting with guests. Is you're already very skilled at this, and you can take it wherever you want to go with it. So it's an honor to have this conversation with you here today, and I look forward to many more in the future.
Good deal. Thanks, Nick.
Cool.
There we go.